Vivian Whitmore smiled as she handed the document to Silas Crow, the man with cold eyes and colder hands, and said 4 words that would end her sister's life as she knew it. "She'll sign. I'll make sure." She didn't look guilty. She looked satisfied, like she'd finally won something she'd been chasing for years. The paper named Eliza, not Vivian. Eliza, the sister who'd patched Vivian's dresses, covered Vivian's lies, and never once asked for anything in return. And now Vivian had sold her. Not for love, not for survival, for spite dressed up as necessity. If you've ever been betrayed by someone who was supposed to protect you, stay with me because this story is going to hit somewhere deep. Before we go further, if you're new here, please subscribe to our channel and follow Eliza's story all the way to the end. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to where it all began. The morning Eliza Whitmore turned 31, nobody remembered. Not her father. Not the ranch hands who ate her cooking every day without a word of thanks. Not a single person in Prosper Creek, Texas, where everybody knew everybody's business but somehow never quite managed to see Eliza standing right in front of them. She woke before the sun, same as always, pulled on her work boots in the dark because the left one had a crack in the sole, and she needed to stuff a piece of folded leather inside before she could walk without it letting in mud. She'd been meaning to get it fixed for 3 months. There was always something more urgent: a fence post rotting through, a calf with a bad leg, feed bills that didn't care what day of the week it was. Eliza was not a small woman. She was broad through the shoulders from years of labor, with hands that had known rope burns and splinter wounds and the kind of calluses that don't go away even if you soak them for an hour. She had her mother's dark eyes, serious eyes, people said, which was the polite way of saying she didn't smile enough. Her hair was thick and brown and usually pinned back so fast in the mornings that she'd find loose pieces falling across her face by noon and not have the patience to deal with them. She was not what Prosper Creek considered beautiful. She had known that since she was old when she overheard 2 of her father's friends talking on the porch, and one of them said, "Shame," about the older Whitmore girl, built like a workhorse, and the other one laughed. She remembered going very still behind the screen door, then going back to the kitchen and washing the supper dishes, 'cause someone had to. That was Eliza's life in 3 sentences. The ranch Whitmore's Crossing, her grandfather had named it, sat on 40 acres of hard Texas soil that gave back less than it took. The grass was sparse in summer, frozen solid in winter, and the cattle they ran were never quite enough to cover what it cost to keep them. Her father, Gerald Whitmore, had the kind of pride that made a man refuse to admit a problem until the problem had both hands around his throat. Gerald was a tall man who had once been handsome and now was just weathered, with a drinker's flush in his cheeks and a habit of making decisions at night that he'd convinced himself were reasonable by morning. He loved Eliza the way some men love useful things, without sentiment, without ceremony, but with a certain possessiveness when anyone else seemed likely to take her away. He loved Vivienne differently. Vivienne was his showpiece, his proof that something good had come from his life. Vivienne Whitmore was 26, 5 years younger than Eliza, and she had inherited their mother's delicate jaw and their father's ability to walk into a room and make people look. She was not cruel in an obvious way. She was cruel the way cold water is cruel. It doesn't mean anything by it, but it still takes the warmth right out of you. She had, over the years, done the following things to her sister. Told Thomas Aldrin that Eliza had laughed at him behind his back when he'd brought Eliza wildflowers, which she hadn't. She'd kept them in a tin can on the windowsill for 2 weeks until they turned to dust. Told the women at the dry goods store that Eliza had. Said Margaret Pruitt's new hat looked like a dead bird, which she'd never said. Shown up at the church social, wearing the blue dress. Eliza had spent 3 evenings hemming for herself and smiled when Eliza appeared in plain brown wool and said, "Oh, did you not finish your dress? I borrowed this one. I hope you don't mind." Eliza had minded. She'd minded every single time. But she had a deep, stubborn conviction that saying so would accomplish nothing. And so she kept the anger in a place behind her sternum, where it sat like a coal not burning, just warm and waiting. The morning Colton Voss arrived in Prosper Creek, Eliza was in the south pasture, trying to coax a lame mare back toward the barn. The horse's name was Duchess, and she was 14 years old and had been favoring her left foreleg for 2 days. Eliza had already examined the hoof, pulled a stone the size of a thumbnail from the frog, packed it with a poultice her mother had taught her to make from comfrey root and lard, and wrapped it in clean cloth. Now she was just standing with her, one hand on the horse's neck, talking low and steady the way you do when you're trying to convince something living that the pain is temporary. You've had worse, Eliza said. That winter you got into the wire fence. Remember that? 3 stitches, and you were still trying to steal my apple the next morning. Duchess flicked an ear. Come on. The barn's dry and I put fresh hay down this morning. The horse took one careful step, then another. Eliza moved with her, not pulling, just present. They went slow across the field, and Eliza didn't rush it, because Duchess didn't deserve to be rushed, and because there was something in the rhythm of it that she needed the simple, clean purpose of one creature helping another, without any complicated feelings attached. She didn't hear the rider until he was almost at the fence line. The man on the gray horse was not from Prosper Creek. She could tell that, at a glance, not from his clothes exactly, though they were better quality than most of what came to town, but from the way he sat in the saddle. Like someone who'd spent so many hours on horseback that stillness was just his natural condition. He reined in at the fence and watched her for a moment without saying anything. Eliza kept moving with Duchess and didn't acknowledge him because she was in the middle of something, and she didn't see why that should stop on account of a stranger. That wrap's going to loosen before she gets to the barn, he said. Eliza glanced at him. Then I'll rewrap it. I've got a better method if you want it. I don't. He was quiet for a moment. Then fair enough. He didn't ride away. He just sat there, which she found annoying, but she had a policy of not feeding annoyance by reacting to it. She got Duchess to the barn. She rewrapped the leg it had loosened, which she'd known it would, but she wasn't about to say so, and settled the mare with water and hay, and a handful of oats she probably didn't need, but earned. When she came back out, the man was still there, dismounted now, his horse tied to the fence post and himself leaning against the rail with his hat in his hands. He was maybe 40, or close to it, hard to tell with men who worked outdoors. Tan face, jaw that needed shaving, gray coming in at his temples. Not handsome in the storybook way, but there was something solid about him, something that made you feel like if you leaned against it, it wouldn't move. You the Whitmore daughter? He asked. One of them. I'm looking for Gerald Whitmore. Most people are. He's usually at the house until 10, then at the Dusty Bell until 4, then back at the house wondering where the afternoon went. She paused. You hear about the cattle? I'm here about a lot of things. He put his hat back on. I'm Colton Voss. I run the Double V spread up in Montana. She'd heard the name. You could not hear it. Colton Voss had bought up 3 failing ranches in the past 2 years and turned them into something, and word traveled in cattle country. She looked at him with a different quality of attention than she'd had a moment ago. My father's not selling, she said. I'm not necessarily buying. Then what are you here for? He looked at her steadily. Like I said, a lot of things. She didn't think about him again for the rest of the day. She had too much to do. There was a section of fence on the north pasture that one of the hands had half fixed and left, which meant she had to finish it herself. And then there was the inventory for the feed store account. And then supper, and then the books, which took her an hour of squinting at columns that never quite added up the way she needed them to. She found something that evening that she'd been half suspecting for weeks. It was in the ledger her father kept in the bottom drawer of his desk, a ledger she wasn't supposed to touch, which was why she waited until he was at the table with a glass of whiskey before she went into the office and pulled it out. She had the right to look. She'd been the one keeping the actual accounts since her mother died 6 years ago. Her father kept this separate ledger for reasons he'd never explained, which meant the reasons were almost certainly ones she wouldn't like. She was right. The numbers told a story she didn't want to read. 3 separate loans, 2 of them from the Prosper Creek Bank and 1 from a private lender whose name she didn't recognize. Crow at an interest rate that made her jaw tighten. The original amounts were bad enough. The accumulated interest was something else entirely. Total figure at the bottom of the page was more than the ranch could produce in 4 years at current rates, even if nothing went wrong, which things always did. She sat there for a long time with the ledger in her hands. Then she heard Vivienne's voice from the hallway, bright and carrying. Papa, Silas Crow sent a note over. He wants to meet with you this week. He says he has a proposal. Eliza closed the ledger very carefully and put it back exactly where she'd found it. Her hands were not shaking. She made sure of that. She met Vivienne at the top of the stairs without planning to. Vivienne was in a yellow dress that cost more than Eliza earned in a month of selling eggs, and she had her hair pinned up in a way that looked effortless and wasn't. She smiled when she saw Eliza. It was the kind of smile that had a second meaning underneath it. "You look tired," Vivienne said. "I've been working. You should rest sometimes. You'll age early." "Vivienne." Eliza stopped on the step below her, so they were almost eye level. "Who is Silas Crow?" Something shifted in Vivienne's face. Just for a second, a tightening around the eyes, a fractional change in the smile. Then it was gone. "A businessman," she said. "He's been helpful to Papa." "How helpful?" "Very." Vivienne tilted her head. "Why? Have you been in Papa's office again?" "I keep the books." "Papa keeps his own books." "Papa keeps records of things he doesn't want anyone to understand," Eliza said. "That's different from keeping books." Vivienne was quiet for a moment. Then she said, pleasantly, "You should focus on what you're good at, Eliza. The horses, the fences, let the rest of it alone." She stepped past her sister and went down the stairs without looking back. Eliza stood on the step and felt the coal behind her sternum pulse once, hot and steady. She was not going to let it alone. She had never once in her life let something alone when it mattered, which was why she was tired all the time, and why nothing ever seemed to get easier. And she accepted this about herself with the same practical resignation with which she accepted the cracked boot sole and the loose fence posts and the ledger full of numbers that didn't add up. She went to bed that night with the figure from the ledger sitting behind her eyes, like a number she was supposed to memorize. 4 years of perfect yield, no disasters, no bad winters, no sick cattle. They had not had one of those years in recent memory, and she did not see one coming. Colton Voss came to the house the next morning. He was brought to the parlor by the ranch hand, Hector, who had the good sense to look uncertain about it. Eliza's father did not generally receive visitors before 9, and it was barely past 8. But Gerald Whitmore came down the stairs in his suspenders with his hair uncombed and shook the man's hand with the forced warmth of someone who knows a man is important and hasn't decided yet how to use that fact. Eliza was in the kitchen. She could hear them through the wall. "Heard good things about your operation," her father said. "Montana man, aren't you? Long way to come?" "I've been through this part of Texas before. Thought it was time to come through again." A pause. "Beautiful country. It is that. I was thinking about looking at some cattle. Yours specifically. I've been told your breeding line is solid." Her father's voice changed, became warmer, more expansive. He liked talking about his cattle. It was the thing he'd genuinely done well. "Sit down, sit, Hector. Get us some coffee." Eliza got the coffee herself and brought it in because she wanted to be in the room. She set the cups down without being asked for an opinion, and Colton Voss glanced at her and she looked back, and neither of them said anything about the day before. She stood near the window while they talked and listened to Colton ask questions about the herd, smart questions, specific questions, the kind that told you the person asking had actually worked cattle and wasn't just performing the conversation. Her father answered, and his answers were mostly accurate, but left out the parts that weren't flattering, which was his habit. When there was a pause, Colton said, without looking at Eliza, "Your daughter tells me you've got a good breeding line on your quarter horses, too." Her father looked at her. "Eliza's the one who handles that end of things." "I know," Colton said. "That's why I'm asking." Her father looked at Colton, and then at Eliza, and then back at Colton. Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite read surprise, maybe, or suspicion. He said, "She knows more about it than I do. Eliza's been running the horse end of things since she was 16. She's good at it," Colton said. Just that, a plain statement. Nobody else in this house had ever said that out loud, in front of her father, before. Not in those words. Not without it being followed by for a girl, or considering, or some other trimming that reduced it back to something acceptable. Eliza looked at the floor. She did not trust what was on her face. 3 days later, she came around the side of the barn at dusk and found Vivienne at the fence, talking to Silas Crow. She recognized him from town, a big man, thick through the chest, with a way of standing that took up more space than he needed. He wore his money openly, which was something Eliza had always found suspect. He was let out a short, ugly laugh. He was laughing at something Vivienne said, and Vivienne had her hand on his arm and her chin tilted up in the way she used when she was making sure someone felt important. Eliza stopped walking. Vivienne noticed her a second later. The expression on her face was not guilt. It was something more complicated. It was the expression of someone who has been doing something they know is wrong, but has decided the wrong is justified. And seeing Eliza standing there was an inconvenience, but not a deterrent. "Eliza," Vivian said brightly. "You know Mr. Crow." "Barely," Eliza said. Crow looked her over in the direct way some men did, as if they were evaluating livestock. "Miss Whitmore, I've heard you're the capable one." "I've heard a few things about you too," she said. "Most of them from a ledger." The silence that followed was not comfortable. Vivian laughed, light and quick. "Eliza's very protective of the ranch accounts." "It's sweet. It's practical," Eliza said. She looked at Crow. "What kind of proposal are you bringing my father?" "That's a conversation for Gerald and me," Crow said pleasantly. "My father has a habit of agreeing to things he doesn't fully understand. Someone should understand them." Crow smiled. "It didn't reach anywhere. I'm sure it'll all be explained in due time, Miss Whitmore. I wouldn't lose any sleep over it." She walked back to the house with her jaw set and the evening air going cool around her, and the absolute certainty that she was already 3 steps behind whatever was being arranged, and that the arrangement was not going to be in her favor. She didn't sleep well that night. She lay in the dark and thought about numbers and names, and a debt that had no solution she could currently see, appliances, and about the way Vivian had stood with her hand on Silas Crow's arm and smiled with all her teeth showing. And somewhere in the house, she could hear her father in his study, moving papers around, looking for something or hiding something, or both. She had learned, over 31 years, that the worst things in her life never announced themselves. They just arrived, already in motion. She had a feeling this one was already very close. The morning after she'd seen Vivian at the fence with Silas Crow, Eliza was up before the sky had decided what color it wanted to be. She didn't sleep past the first gray light anymore, hadn't in years, really, though. She couldn't remember exactly when that had changed. Maybe after her mother died, maybe before. Sleep had become something she did in pieces, like a quilt that never quite covered everything at once. She was in the barn by 5:30, working through the morning feeding with Hector, who was 62 years old and had worked Whitmore's Crossing longer than Eliza had been alive. He was a compact, weathered man with a bad hip he never complained about and an opinion about everything he rarely offered unless directly asked. She found him reliable in the way that old familiar tools are reliable, not exciting, not particularly flexible, but present and functional in ways you'd miss immediately if they were gone. They worked in silence for a while, which was how Hector preferred it in the mornings. Eliza was grateful for that. She had too much turning over in her mind to want conversation. She was measuring out grain when he spoke. "Saw Crow's man ride through the south property line yesterday evening," Hector said. Not accusatory, just informational, the way he delivered most things. Eliza looked up. "Which man?" "Don't know his name." "Big fellow on a roan. He had a survey map." She set the grain scoop down. "A survey map. Folded up, but I could see what it was." "He stopped at the fence line between us and the Henderson parcel and spent a good while looking at it." Eliza stood very still for a moment. The Henderson parcel was 12 acres that abutted the southeastern edge of Whitmore's Crossing, technically abandoned land, since old Ira Henderson had died 2 winters back, with no heir anyone knew of. But it sat directly between the ranch's best water source and the access road to the cattle market trail. Without easy passage through that land, moving a large herd to market would add 2 days to the drive, minimum. "Did he say anything to you?" she asked. "He didn't see me," Hector said. "I made sure of that." She picked the scoop back up and finished what she was doing because stopping in the middle of a task never fixed the problem that made you want to stop. But she was thinking hard, the kind of thinking that uses the whole inside of your skull and crowds out everything else. Silas Crow had lent her father money at rates that would have embarrassed a loan shark. He was now sniffing around the edges of her property lines with survey maps. And her sister was standing at fences with him, laughing with her hand on his arm. She needed to know more. She needed to know more now. She found Colton Voss at the Dusty Bell, which she hadn't expected. She'd gone into town to pick up a supply order from the dry goods store, and she saw his gray horse tied at the rail outside the saloon. And she stopped walking and stood on the opposite side of the street for a moment longer than was strictly dignified, debating with herself. She went in anyway. She had never been particularly interested in what people thought of a woman who went into a saloon when she needed to, which had been a point of small scandal exactly twice in her life, and hadn't much bothered her either time. It wasn't a large establishment. 5 tables, a bar with a mirror behind it that had a crack running diagonal across the lower left corner that had been there since before Eliza could remember. Colton was at a corner table with a cup of coffee and what looked like a ledger of his own, and he glanced up when she came in with the same quality of attention he'd had at the fence line. The first day, not startled, not performing indifference, just seeing her. She sat down across from him without being invited, because she hadn't been raised to wait for invitations when she needed something. "You're looking at property," she said. He put his pen down. "Good morning to you, too. I don't have a lot of time for good mornings lately. Someone's been walking Crow's man along my fence line with a survey map." He looked at her steadily. Something in his expression shifted just barely, not surprise, she thought, but something adjacent to it. Recognition, maybe. "How long have you known about the debt?" he asked. She hadn't expected him to know about the debt. She kept her face level. "Long enough. Your father's been borrowing from Crow for 3 years, Colton said. He wasn't consulting his ledger. He was talking from memory, which meant he'd been sitting on this information for a while, turning it over. The original loan was for the East Pasture expansion. Crow offered terms your father didn't read carefully enough. Interest compounded in a way that made the original amount almost irrelevant within 18 months. How do you know this? Because Crow has done it to 6 other ranches in this county in the past 4 years, he said. I've been watching him. I came to Prosper Creek because your family's name came up in documents I was already looking at. He paused. I'm not here just to buy cattle, Miss Whitmore. She sat back. Why didn't you say that to my father? Because your father isn't going to help himself out of this, he said. It wasn't cruel. It was just accurate, delivered without decoration. I needed to understand what the situation actually was before I said anything to anyone, including you, and now you understand it. I'm getting there. She looked at him across the table. He held her gaze without effort, which was something she noticed. Most men looked away eventually when she held eye contact too long, as if they weren't sure what she was looking for and were afraid she'd find it. What does Crow want, she said. Not the money. What does he actually want? Colton was quiet for a moment. The water rights on your southeast corner and passage access to the market trail. He's been building toward a land position that would give him control of the primary route to the cattle market out of this valley. If he gets that access, he can charge every rancher within 20 miles for market rights. He'd own the only viable route. Eliza thought about Hector and the roan horse and the survey map. The Henderson parcel, she said. He's already filed a purchase claim on it. Or someone has on his behalf. He watched her. Your family's debt gives him legal leverage. If your father can't pay on demand, and Crow can trigger a demand clause, whenever he decides to, Crow can move to seize assets, including the land adjacent to the southeast corner. And my father doesn't know any of this. Your father knows some of it, Colton said. I'm not sure he understands it. That sat between them for a moment. Outside, a horse went past, and someone called out to someone else, and the ordinary sounds of the town kept while Eliza reconfigured everything she thought she knew about the situation she was in. Why are you telling me? She asked. He picked up his coffee. Because you're the one running the ranch. She almost said something sharp. She stopped herself. He wasn't being condescending. He was saying the same thing she'd known and carried for years. Only he was saying it like it was simply a fact and not something to apologize for or be embarrassed about. I'm telling you, he continued, because you're the only person on that property who's going to do anything about it if it's possible to do anything. And I think it might be possible. What kind of possible? Complicated kind, he said. The kind that takes time we may not have as much of as I'd like. She stood up. She had a supply order to pick up and calculations to run, and a father to talk to. That conversation was going to be unpleasant, but she'd been putting it off and putting it off and putting it off was no longer a strategy that served her. I'll be at the ranch tomorrow morning. If you want to explain the complicated kind, you can explain it there. He nodded once. She left. She got halfway to the dry goods store before she realized her hands were balled up at her sides, not from anger, but from something she didn't have a ready word for. It felt uncomfortably like the beginning of not being alone in something. She wasn't sure yet whether that was a relief or just a different kind of problem. She told her father that evening. Not everything. She wasn't foolish enough to give him the whole picture at once, because Gerald Whitmore when presented with information that overwhelmed him, had two responses available: defensiveness and whiskey. She gave him the part about the debt and the interest and the demand clause, and she watched his face sequence of expressions that ended somewhere between shame and stubbornness. I know about the debt, he said. Do you know about the demand clause? Pause. Crow's a businessman. He's been reasonable. He's been patient, she said. That's different from reasonable. He's been patient because he was waiting for the Henderson parcel to come available. And now it has, and now he has everything he needs. Her father looked at the glass in his hand. He'd poured it when she came in and hadn't drunk from it, which she took as a sign he understood this was a serious conversation. Crow said he saw a way to settle the debt, he said. Proposal. I know. You don't know what the proposal is. Tell me. He didn't answer right away. The fire in the grate popped. Outside, a dog somewhere in the distance barked twice and went quiet. He wants to take a wife, her father said. He's of an age where he wants to settle. Have children. He stopped. Eliza waited. He's willing to forgive the debt entirely in exchange for a marriage arrangement. The ranch would stay in family hands. No liens, no seizure. Her father still wasn't looking at her. He's not a young man, but he's established. The woman would want for nothing. Papa! Her voice was very quiet. Which woman? The silence that followed was the longest one in that room since her mother's funeral. He specified, her father said. He wants a woman who can run a household, who's capable with land and animals. Who isn't? He stopped again. Started again. He was specific. He wants me. Her father looked up finally. He thinks you're practical, capable. He said those things. He looked at me like I was a broodmare, she said. And you're standing there telling me a man who has engineered our financial ruin is willing to trade his forgiveness of a debt he deliberately constructed for the right to own me, and you want me to consider it. Eliza, don't. She stood up. Her voice was not shaking, and she was proud of that fact. Don't call my name like I'm being unreasonable. Tell me you haven't agreed to this. He looked back at the fire. Papa, tell me you haven't agreed. I haven't signed anything, he said. Nothing's been signed. That's not what I asked. He didn't answer, and that was in its way an answer. She walked out of the room. She went upstairs and closed her door with the particular control of someone who wants badly to slam it and won't give herself the satisfaction. She sat on the edge of her bed in the dark and breathed. Once, twice, counted backward from 10 the way her mother had taught her when she was small and angry at something. She got to 3 before she stood back up. She wasn't a person who sat in the dark when there was something to be done. Problem was figuring out what that something was. She found Vivian's room empty, which meant Vivian was somewhere she wasn't supposed to be, which was not unusual, but felt different tonight. She went through the house to the back porch and stood in the night air and looked out across the dark shapes of the pasture and thought about Colton Voss and his ledger and his careful way of laying out information like he was building something and making sure each piece was solid before he set the next one on top. She thought about what he'd said, the complicated kind of possible. She thought about her father, sitting in that chair, not looking at her. She thought about Silas Crow, and the survey map, and the Henderson parcel, and the water rights, and the market trail, and she tried to see the whole shape of it, the way you try to see a large painting by stepping back, not the individual strokes, but the entire thing at once. Crow didn't want the marriage, not primarily. He wanted the land leverage that came with having a Whitmore wife, someone who was effectively the operational head of the ranch, whose cooperation he could compel through the simple fact of marriage laws that left a wife's property in her husband's hands. He'd get the ranch access, the water rights, and the market route through the legal mechanism of a woman who had no say in whether she agreed. The man was patient and he was thorough, and he had built something careful and horrible over 3 years, and he had done it with the help of a debt. Her father was too proud and too frightened to admit he couldn't pay. She was still on the porch when she heard footsteps in the grass, and she turned and saw Vivian coming around the side of the house from the direction of the road. Vivian stopped when she saw her. Just for a second, that fractional hesitation that meant she hadn't expected company. It's late, Eliza said. I was walking. Vivian moved toward the porch steps. She'd changed out of the yellow dress, was wearing a dark blue one now, which struck Eliza as deliberate choice. For an evening walk, something you could move through shadows in without being easily seen. Where? Just the lane. I needed air. Vivian. Eliza kept her voice level. Did you know what Crow was proposing before Papa told me? Her sister's hand was on the porch rail. She didn't look up. I knew he was interested in a resolution to the debt. Did you know which resolution he had in mind? A beat. I knew he was looking for a wife. Did you tell him I was available? Vivienne looked up at that. Her expression in the dark was difficult to read, but Eliza had been reading her sister's face for 26 years, and she caught the edges of it, the slight defensive set to the jaw, eyes that went somewhere else for half a second before coming back. I told him the truth about who runs this ranch, Vivienne said. That's all. That's all. Eliza said it back flat without emphasis. You told a man who was looking for a wife, who had a financial stranglehold on our family, exactly which member of this family was indispensable to the property. You told him that, and you think that's just telling the truth. You make it sound like I arranged something, didn't you? Vivienne's chin came up. I was protecting this family. The debt is real, Eliza. The numbers are real. Crow is offering a way out that keeps the ranch in our hands. Would you rather we lost everything? I would rather we found a solution that didn't involve selling a person, Eliza said. But more than that, I would like to know whether my sister has spent the last several weeks helping a man build a cage with my name on it and calling it family loyalty. Vivienne said nothing. Her expression shifted through several things and settled somewhere cold. You've always wanted to be the one who suffers, Vivienne said finally. Her voice was quiet and precise. You've always wanted everyone to see how hard you work and how little you get and how unfair it all is. This is practical, Eliza. This is real life. You're right that this is real life, Eliza said. I'll give you that. She went inside. She heard Vivienne on the porch behind her, not following, just standing there. She climbed the stairs and went back to her room, and this time she did sit in the dark, because some things need a few minutes of darkness to become real. She sat there and she thought about Colton Voss and his complicated kind of possible, and she thought that whatever he'd meant by it, she needed to hear it soon, because the morning was coming and the day after it and the one after that, and Silas Crow was a patient man, but patience was not permanent. He came to the ranch the next morning like she'd asked, and she met him at the barn before her father was up. She told him about the proposal. Not with emotion, she'd used up the emotion the night before, and what was left was information. And information was the thing they needed to work with. She laid it out clean and direct, the way she'd do an accounting ledger, and she watched his face while she talked. He didn't look surprised, which she'd half expected. He looked like someone hearing a thing they'd feared confirmed. Crow's done something like this before, he said. Not in Texas, farther north, different name, same structure. He finds a family in debt, engineers the terms so repayment becomes impossible, then offers an arrangement that appears to solve the problem while giving him everything he actually wanted from the beginning. He looked at her. It's not an accident. It's a system. He's done it to other families. To other women, Colton said. He wasn't softening it. Cattle and the land, those are leverage. But what he actually collects is people. She absorbed that. Standing in the barn with the horses moving behind her and the early light coming through the side door in long flat angles. You said there was a complicated possible, she said. I need you to tell me what that means. It means I've been building a legal case against Crow's loan practices for 8 months, he said. I've got documentation from 3 other ranchers, signed affidavits, original loan document with the predatory clauses, marked testimony from a lawyer in Fort Worth who's seen this pattern before. It's enough to challenge the enforceability of the debt in court. Court takes time. It does. We may not have that time. If my father has already indicated consent to Crow's proposal. I know. He looked at her directly. That's why I need to move faster than I planned. He paused. I need your father to give me access to the original loan documentation. The copy Crow has is one version. What your father signed, if I can show discrepancies between the two, it changes the legal picture significantly. It's the difference between a case that takes a year and a case that might move in weeks. My father isn't going to give you access to anything he's ashamed of. No, Colton said. He isn't. They were both quiet for a moment, understanding each other. I can get it, Eliza said. I know you can, Cindy said. That's not what I'm asking you to decide right now. She looked at him. What are you asking me to decide? He was quiet for just a beat too long, which was the first time she'd seen him unsure of his words. I'm asking whether you trust me enough to let me work this in the way I know how to work it, which means not telling you every step as I take it because there are steps I won't be sure about until I'm taking them. It was an honest thing to say. She respected that, even as she felt the edges of it. "I've been managing this ranch for 15 years, she said. "I don't work blind. I'm not asking you to work blind. I'm asking you to work with someone." She didn't answer right away. The mare in the nearest stall pushed her nose against the gate, looking for attention, and Eliza put a hand on the animal's face, automatically without looking at her, just offering the contact. Working with someone. It sounded simple. It was not simple. She had learned, over 31 years and more painful lessons than she cared to count, that working with someone required a specific kind of trust that she had never found easy to extend. Not because she was incapable of it, but because the people she'd tried to extend it to had a tendency to take it and fold it up small and put it in their pocket where it became their thing instead of the shared thing it was supposed to be. She looked at Colton Voss. He was looking back at her without impatience, without the slightly urgent need to fill the silence that most people had. He had asked his question, and he was waiting for her answer without performing the waiting. "I'll get you the documents," she said, "and you'll tell me what you find." "Everything I find," he said. "Everything." "Yes." She held his gaze for another second. "Then let's get to work." Getting the documents was not simple, because nothing about her life was simple, and because her father's office was a room with a solid lock, and her father was a man who had started sleeping badly and waking at strange hours, which meant she couldn't count on the predictability of his schedule the way she once could. She waited 3 days. 3 days in which Silas Crow sent 2 more notes to the house. She intercepted one by accident, coming in from the barn at the wrong time, and finding Hector standing uncertain in the hall with an envelope in his hand, looking like he wasn't sure who he was supposed to give it to. She took it. She read it. It was a short note, politely worded in the surface way that real threats often are. It said Crow was looking forward to finalizing their arrangement and would appreciate a response by end of week. End of week was 4 days away. She put the note in her pocket and went and found her father in the parlor. He was looking at nothing in particular when she came in. He looked, she thought, like a man who has been carrying something too long, and the carrying has changed his posture permanently. "Crow sent a note," she said. She didn't give it to him. "He wants an answer by the end of the week." Her father rubbed his face. "Have you talked to anyone else about this? Anyone who might know how to—" "There's nobody," he said. "The bank won't touch a loan with Crow's claim on the property. I talked to Fletcher at the bank 2 weeks ago. He wasn't even able to look me in the face. I need your loan documents," she said. "The originals. The ones you signed 3 years ago." He looked at her. Something moved across his face, resistance, and then something underneath the resistance that was almost relief. "Why?" "Because someone is looking at them who might be able to help." "Who?" She was quiet for a moment. She thought about trust, and about how her father had sat in that chair and not told Crow no, and about the fact that he was still her father, and he was scared. "Colton Voss," she said. Her father looked at her for a long moment. He knew the name, had done business conversations with the man, had sat in the parlor, and drunk coffee, and talked cattle. She watched him work through the implications. "Voss is looking into Crow," he said. Not a question, just him arriving there. "Yes." "For how long?" "Long enough to have something useful." She waited. He got up from his chair, which cost him something she could see it, in the way he moved. The stiffness that had nothing to do with his joints and everything to do with the fact that what he was about to do was an admission he'd been avoiding. He went to the office. She heard the drawer open. He came back with a folder of documents, worn at the edges and held together with a string. He held it out to her. She took it. "Eliza," he said. She looked up. He stopped. Tried again. "I made decisions I shouldn't have made alone." It was not an apologies exactly. It was the closest he could get to one, she suspected. She looked at her father and felt a complicated, compressed sadness that had been accumulating for years. For all the times he hadn't seen her, hadn't fought for her, hadn't been what he should have been, and she let it sit for exactly 1 moment before she put it away. There were more immediate problems. "I know," she said. "Let me see if we can fix it." She took the folder and went out, and she didn't look back because she needed to see where she was going, not where she'd been. Colton was waiting at the fence where she'd first seen him, and she crossed the pasture to meet him, with the folder in her hand, and the morning going bright around her. And when she handed the documents to him, he went still for a moment, looking at the cover page before he even opened it. "What?" she asked. "The date," he said. He turned it so she could see. "The date on this is 2 months before he claims it was signed." She looked at the date. Then she looked at him. He's been holding an older claim than your father knew about, Colton said quietly. His voice had gone to something careful and precise, like a man stepping across ice. This isn't just predatory lending, Miss Whitmore. There are documents here that were altered after the fact. I need to get these to the lawyer in Fort Worth. But if I'm right about what I'm seeing, he stopped. He looked up from the paper at her. This changes things considerably. She looked at the date on the page, the number that didn't match what her father thought he'd signed, at the careful, elaborate machinery of a trap that had been built before anyone in her family had any idea it existed. Considerably how, she said. Considerably in the direction of Crow having committed fraud, he said, which means the debt may not be legally enforceable at all. Which means he has nothing, she said. Colton looked at her steadily. If we can prove it. She looked back at the documents, at the altered date, at 3 years of her life and her father's mistakes and her sister's casual betrayals and a man who had decided she was something to be purchased and arranged, and she felt the coal behind her sternum pulse once, hot and absolutely clear. Then let's prove it, she said. The wind moved across the pasture. Duchess was visible in the near field, moving better than she had a week ago, the wrapped leg carrying her easy and steady across the grass. Somewhere behind them, in the direction of the house, Eliza could hear Vivienne's voice. She couldn't make out the words, just the tone. Bright and deliberate, performing some small cheerful scene for an audience that didn't know it was watching a performance. Colton was looking at the documents again, his brow down, his mind already moving into the next problem. She watched him for a moment, this stranger who had arrived with careful questions and a ledger of his own, who had told her the truth without softening it, who had asked her to work with him and then waited for her actual answer instead of assuming it. She wasn't sure yet what to make of him. She was still working on that, but she knew what she made of the documents in his hands, and she knew what she made of the date that didn't match, and she knew what she intended to do about Silas Crow and his patient, elaborate plans. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have prepared herself for, was what Vivienne was doing at that exact moment on the other side of the house, with a pen in her hand and a letter she'd been composing for 2 days, and a decision she'd already made and had no intention of changing. Eliza didn't know about the letter yet. She wouldn't know for another 3 days, and by then the thing the letter had set in motion would already be running. She folded her arms against the morning chill and looked out across the pasture and thought about the word proof and what it required, and whether they had enough time to get it, and what would happen if they didn't. She had never been a person who prepared for failure. She prepared for difficulty, which was different. Failure meant you'd stopped. Difficulty just meant you hadn't gotten there yet. She wasn't done yet, not even close. The letter arrived at Silas Crow's office on a Tuesday. Eliza didn't know that yet. She was in the south pasture pulling a fence post that had rotted through at the base, working the iron bar under the wood and levering it up by increments. Her boots sunk 2 inches into wet ground from the rain that had come through the night before. It was the kind of work that required your full physical attention and left your mind free to run, which was not always a gift. Spent the 3 days since handing Colton the documents in a state of careful waiting that she was not naturally suited to. He had ridden out the same afternoon with the folder secured in his saddlebag, heading toward the telegraph office first, and Fort Worth second, and he'd told her it would take time to get the documentation to the lawyer and time to get a response, and she understood that intellectually. What she understood intellectually and what she could make her nervous system accept were 2 separate negotiations. Hector came across the pasture at a pace that was slightly faster than his usual, which on Hector meant something was wrong. Man at the house, he said. Crow's man, the one with the roan. She set the iron bar against the fence rail. What does he want? Says he's delivering a formal notice. He asked for Mr. Whitmore, but your father's not. I couldn't find your father. She already knew where her father was. He'd been at the Dusty Bell since noon because the waiting was eating him the same way. It was eating her, only he had a different method of dealing with it. I'll take the notice, she said. Crow's man was standing in the yard the big fellow Hector had described, thick through the chest, with a flat, professionally empty expression. He handed her an envelope without preamble. She took it. He mounted and rode without a word. She opened it standing in the yard with the mud still on her boots. It was written in legal language, which she read carefully, because legal language has a way of hiding the actual meaning inside the formal one. She read it twice. The actual meaning was this: Silas Crowe was invoking the demand clause on the primary loan, effective in 14 days. Payment in full was required, or the terms of the alternate arrangement, the marriage proposal, would be considered accepted by default. Failure to respond to either option would result in immediate proceedings to seize the property assets listed in the attached schedule. The attached schedule included the ranch house, the barn, the livestock, the water rights, and the southeastern parcel that was the point of access to the market trail. 14 days. She folded the letter. She went to find her father. He was where she expected, at the far end of the Dusty Bell's bar, with a glass in front of him that was more empty than full. He looked up when she came in, and she could tell from his face that some part of him had been expecting her. She put the letter on the bar in front of him. He read it. He put it down and didn't say anything. 14 days, she said. I heard you the first time. I didn't say it twice. He looked at his glass. We don't have the money, Eliza. You know the numbers better than I do. We don't have it. I know that. That's not what I'm talking about. She lowered her voice. There were 2 other men at the far end of the bar who weren't paying attention to them, or were performing not paying attention, which was more likely. Colton Voss is in Fort Worth with the original documents, the ones you gave me. He thinks there's fraud in the way the loan was structured. If he can get legal confirmation, if. Her father said the word like it tasted bad. Yes, if. We are working with if right now, but it's a better if than we had a week ago. Gerald Whitmore looked at his hands on the bar. They were old man's hands now. She realized she didn't often let herself see that. The specific age of him, the way time had moved through him while she'd been busy managing around him. And if Voss can't get what he needs in 14 days, he said. She didn't answer that because the answer was the thing neither of them wanted to say out loud. That if Colton came back empty-handed, the options narrowed to something she couldn't agree to, and a loss she couldn't prevent. Let me worry about that when it happens, she said. Right now, go home. I need you clear-headed and at the house in case Crow sends anyone else. He nodded slowly. He left the glass where it was, which she took as a small, hopeful sign about his state of mind, even if it didn't fix anything else. She waited until he was gone, then ordered a coffee she didn't want, and stood at the bar and thought. 14 days. Colton had said he needed time. Time was now a specific and shrinking number. She needed to send word to him. She needed to know where exactly he was in the process, what the lawyer in Fort Worth had found, whether the date discrepancy was enough or whether they needed more. She wrote him a brief telegram at the telegraph office on the way back, keeping the words functional, because telegrams cost per word and she wasn't in the habit of spending money on language she could cut. She rode home in the early evening with the letter in her pocket and the pastures going gold around her, and tried to foul something other than the particular dread of someone who has done everything they can think to do and is not certain it will be enough. Vivienne was in the kitchen when she got back, which was unusual. Vivienne cooked approximately 4 times a year, under conditions of domestic necessity so extreme that even she couldn't delegate them. She had bread dough on the board in front of her, and flour on her dress, and an expression of determined pleasantness that Eliza recognized as the face her sister when she was performing normalcy for herself. They hadn't spoken directly since the night on the porch. They let out a short, navigated the same house for 3 days, in the way of people who have said the true things, and now have to figure out how to share space with the truth between them. Papa's on his way home, Eliza said. She hung her coat. He should eat something, I know, Vivienne said. This is why I'm doing this. Eliza looked at her sister's back. Careful work of the hands on the dough, the flour on the dark dress. Vivienne, she said, don't. I haven't said anything yet. You're going to say something about Crow. Or about the letter. I heard about the letter from Hector. Of course you did. Eliza sat down at the table. She was tired in the deep way, the kind that isn't fixed by one night's sleep, but requires about a week of ordinary life to clear. Did you send him something? In the last week. Did you write to Crow or his people? The hands on the dough slowed slightly and then resumed at the same pace. I don't see why that's your concern. Because 14 days ago we had a month, possibly. Now we have 14 days. And the timing is a coincidence, Vivienne said sharply. She turned around and there was flour on her cheek, and her eyes were bright in the way they got when she was angry, but didn't want to be seen as angry. I didn't write to anyone. I haven't done anything. Eliza looked at her for a long moment. Her sister's face was composed and bright-eyed and certain, the way it had been when she told Thomas Aldrin that Eliza had laughed at him, the way it had been when she appeared at the church social in the blue dress, a face that knew how to mean the opposite of what it was showing. "All right," Eliza said. "You don't believe me." I said, "All right." Vivienne turned back to the bread. "You've always thought the worst of me. I've thought the accurate thing about you," Eliza said quietly. "That's not the same as the worst." The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of hands working dough and the fire under the stove, and somewhere outside the distant sound of a horse in the barn, settling for the night. Eliza looked at her sister's back, the familiar line of it, the particular way Vivienne held her shoulders. Posture that had been in this kitchen every day of their lives, and felt something that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite anger, but sat in the space between them. She went to bed early and slept badly, and woke before dawn with the letter still on the nightstand where she'd put it, the number 14 already reduced by 1. Colton's response came back 2 days later. She was at the telegraph office herself, having gone in for supplies, when the clerk called her over. The telegram was brief his. She was learning. Always were. It said the lawyer had confirmed the date alteration on the primary document. It said there was a second finding, a signature on the collateral clause that showed signs of having been traced rather than signed. A forgery, or close enough to one that it would require expert examination to definitively prove, which took time they didn't have. It said he was coming back and would be in Prosper Creek by Thursday. Thursday was 5 days before the 14-day deadline. She stood on the boardwalk outside the telegraph office and read the telegram 3 times and tried to calculate what could be accomplished in 5 days with a confirmed date alteration, possible signature forgery, and a lawyer who was 5 hours away by train. The math was not comfortable, but it wasn't impossible. She was still standing there when she heard her name spoken in a tone of pleasant social observation, and turned to find Margaret Pruitt and 2 other women from town coming out of the milliner's shop across the street. Margaret Pruitt was the wife of the bank manager, and had, in Eliza's experience, an infallible instinct for appearing wherever information was most available. "Miss Whitmore," she said warmly, "I was just telling Clara about your father's situation. So unfortunate." Eliza tucked the telegram into her coat pocket. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Pruitt. We heard that Crow's made quite a generous offer, all things considered." Margaret had a way of delivering devastating observations while maintaining a tone of complete benevolent concern. "I imagine it must be a relief, knowing there's a resolution." "I imagine," Eliza said. "Of course, some of us thought it was the younger sister he'd be interested in." Margaret glanced at Clara, who made the politely suppressed expression of someone who'd heard this opinion offered before. "Crow's a practical man, I suppose. He needs someone capable." Eliza looked at Margaret Pruitt very directly, which most people found disconcerting. "You're right that he needs someone capable," she said. "Unfortunately for him, capable women tend to have opinions about who they marry." She walked away before Margaret could respond. She heard the tight, controlled silence behind her that meant Margaret was composing a response she'd deliver to Clara once Eliza was out of earshot. She didn't care. She was thinking about Thursday. Vivienne found the response copy of the telegram on Wednesday evening. Eliza had been careless. She'd left the paper on her desk when she went to deal with a fence situation in the north pasture that required 3 hours and more creative profanity than she normally permitted herself. When she came back, the desk looked exactly as she'd left it, which was the tell. Vivienne, when she searched a room, always put things back. It was a habit from childhood, the way a person learns to cover their tracks when they've been covering them long enough. The telegram had been face down when she left. It was face down when she returned, but the edge of it was oriented 2 inches to the right of where she'd left it. Eliza stood at the desk and looked at this for a moment, and then she looked at the door, and then she sat down and thought about what Vivienne had now read. The telegram confirmed the date alteration and the possible forgery. It said Colton was coming back Thursday. It said there were legal grounds being assembled. If Vivienne had read that and told Crow if she'd sent word tonight. She was across the hall and knocking on Vivienne's door before she'd fully made the decision to get up. Vivienne opened it in her dressing gown. Her expression did the thing it always did when she was caught in something, the brief 0-point rearrangement before the pleasant version settled over it. "Were you in my room?" Eliza said. "I was looking for the blue thread. I thought I left it on your desk." "You don't own blue thread. I've never seen you sew a thing in your life." Vivian's chin came up. "Eliza, have you sent anything to Crow tonight? Anything since this afternoon?" "No." "Look me in the face and say that." Vivian looked her in the face. "No," she said again. Her voice was steady, and her eyes were steady, and her expression was composed and perfectly, fluently dishonest. Eliza had grown up watching that face. She knew its calibration. "If you've told him anything in the last 24 hours that affects what Colton's trying to do," Eliza said, "I want you to understand what that means. Not for me, for Papa, for this ranch, for whether any of us have anything left in 2 weeks." Something moved across Vivienne's face, not guilt exactly, but something adjacent. Crack in the composition that lasted less than a second. "I know what it means," Vivienne said. "Do you?" "Because I'm not sure you've been thinking about what it means." "I think you've been thinking about what you want, which is what you always think about. And you've been telling yourself that what you want happens to be good for the family, and those two things have never been as aligned as you need them to be." Vivienne said nothing. Eliza stood in the doorway and looked at her sister and felt the full, exhausting weight of 26 years. Of being the one who saw the thing that was happening, who said the true thing, who cleaned up what was left behind, and she let the feeling exist for exactly a moment before she set it down. "Get some sleep," she said. She went back to her room. She didn't sleep. She sat at her desk and waited for the morning, and prayed that Vivienne had told her the truth, knowing in the specific way she'd always known such things that she probably hadn't. She was right. Crow arrived the next day, which was Thursday morning, 6 hours before Colton Voss was due in from Fort Worth. He came with 2 men she'd never seen, not ranch hands, not the survey man, but men with a particular quality of stillness that told you they were hired for their presence rather than their conversation. He came to the house and asked for Gerald Whitmore, and Eliza's father came down the stairs with a face that had already given up before anyone had said a word. Eliza stayed in the room. She'd had to make an ugly laugh. She'd had to make a decision about that, and she'd made it that leaving would be taken as a signal she didn't want to give, and that staying meant she'd know exactly what was said, and knowledge was the only resource she currently had in surplus. Crow sat across from her father in the parlor with his hands on his knees and his posture of complete reasonableness. The posture of a man who is winning and knows it, and has the social grace to be pleasant about it. "Gerald," he said, in the tone of a man addressing an old friend, "I want to make this easy for everyone." "You've already made it very specific," her father said. "I'm here because I thought a face-to-face conversation was more respectful than letters." Crow glanced at Eliza. His expression, when he looked at her, was proprietary in a way that made the skin on her arms go tight. "I'd like to speak to your daughter as well, if she's willing." "I'm here," Eliza said. "Say what you came to say." He looked at her with the careful, assessing attention of a man who finds difficulty in a woman professionally interesting rather than deterring. "I understand there may be some legal questions being raised about the documentation of our arrangement," he said. "I want to assure you that everything is in order. My lawyers have reviewed the documents thoroughly. Any questions about dates or signatures are these things happen with old paperwork, Miss Whitmore. It doesn't change the validity of the underlying agreement. The underlying agreement was signed under terms that weren't disclosed clearly," she said. "I disagree with that characterization. I imagine you do." His expression stayed pleasant. "I came to make a personal offer, separate from the legal questions. I'm prepared to extend the 14-day deadline by 1 week if your family will commit, in writing, to the terms of the alternate arrangement by end of day tomorrow." He paused. 1 week of additional time is a significant concession. "What you're asking for in exchange for that week is not a concession," Eliza said. "It's a purchase, Eliza." Her father's voice was low and warning. "It's a purchase," she said again. She kept her eyes on Son Crow. "You're asking my father to commit in writing to giving you a person, his daughter, in exchange for a debt you structured to be unpayable and are now using as leverage to get what you actually wanted from the beginning, which was access to this property and the market route through it." Crow was quiet for a moment. His pleasant expression remained, but something underneath it shifted, something that had been pretending to be patience and was actually something colder. "You're an intelligent woman," he said. I've always appreciated that about you. I don't need your appreciation. No, he said, but you do need the debt resolved, and right now I'm the only offer on the table that does that. She looked at him, at the two men, in the hallway, at her father sitting in the chair with his shoulders at the angle of someone who has already made his peace with a bad outcome. She felt the 14 days pressing against her like a wall, and behind the wall Colton Voss on a train from Fort Worth with documentation that might be enough and might not be, and the timeline between those two. Things narrowing to something that felt like a thread. I'd like you to leave, she said. Crow stood. He was unhurried. He took his hat from the side table where he'd set it and put it on with the particular deliberateness of a man, making a point about who owns the room. I'll expect word by tomorrow evening, he said. Gerald, he nodded at her father. He looked at Eliza for a moment with something that wasn't quite a smile. Then he left. The sound of horses leaving the yard faded. Her father sat in his chair without moving. He's not going to wait, her father said. He'll wait until he has what he needs, and not a minute longer. She was already thinking about what Colton had said, about the documents and the date alteration and the lawyer in Fort Worth. If there was any way to compress the timeline, if there was someone local who could file an injunction, something to slow Crow's ability to act legally while the challenge was being built. She went to find her coat. Where are you going? Her father called. Into town. I need to see the county clerk. On what grounds? She stopped in the doorway. On the grounds that Silas Crow filed a purchase claim on the Henderson parcel using documentation we may now have grounds to dispute, and I want to know exactly what he filed and when and whether there's a legal mechanism to flag the dispute publicly before he can make it disappear. Her father stared at her. We're not out of road, she said. We still have road. She wasn't certain of that, but she said it the way you say the true version of a thing when the situation requires the true version, not the qualified one. The county clerk was a small, precise man named Aldous Birch, who had held the position for 22 years and had the attitude of someone who had seen every variety of human foolishness pass through his office and had developed a professional compassion for it. He knew the Whitmore family, and he knew the property, and when Eliza laid out what she needed, he listened with the focused attention of a man who took the weight of records seriously. Crow's claim on the Henderson parcel is filed, he confirmed, running his finger down the register. Filed 6 weeks ago, actually, before Ira Henderson's estate was formally closed. Can you file that? It's been done before. There are ways. He looked at her carefully. If you're challenging on the grounds of document fraud, Miss Whitmore, you'd need legal representation. Can't enter a dispute flag without a lawyer's filing. If I had a lawyer's filing by tomorrow afternoon? He looked at her for a long moment. If you had a filing by tomorrow afternoon, I could enter it into the register before close of business. He paused. I'd need to, obviously, as part of my duties. Obviously, she said. She left the clerk's office and went directly to the telegraph office and sent another message to Fort Worth, not to Colton, but to the lawyer, whose name was Harlan Marsh, and whose address she'd gotten from Colton's earlier telegram. She told him what she'd found at the clerk's office. She told him about the demand clause and the deadline. She told him she needed a filing by tomorrow afternoon at the latest and asked him what was possible. Then she went back to the ranch and waited. She didn't tell her father about the telegram to Marsh, because her father's ability to hold complicated hope was limited, and she needed him functional, not suspended in the particular paralysis of too many possible outcomes. She didn't tell Vivian anything. She told Hector to let her know the moment any rider came to the property from any direction, and Hector said yes, in the way he's always said yes without commentary, without reassurance, just yes, and he went back to his work. The response from Harlan Marsh came at 7 the next morning. She was at the telegraph office before it opened, waiting on the boardwalk in the early cold, her breath making small clouds in the still air. The clerk, a young man named Perkins, who was new enough to the job that he still found being early impressive, unlocked the door to find her already standing there and blinked. The telegram was longer than Colton's usually were, which she took as significant. Marsh had received Colton's documents and her update about the clerk's office. He had, working through the night apparently, drafted a legal challenge to the enforceability of the loan based on the date alteration in the primary document and what he described as material misrepresentation of the compound interest terms at signing. He could file the challenge with the county He could transmit a copy to the county clerk for the dispute flag on the Henderson parcel claim simultaneously. He said it would not immediately nullify the debt or stop all of Crow's options, but it would create a legal stise on the demand clause, meaning Crow could not trigger the seizure provisions while the fraud claim was under formal dispute. It would buy them time, possibly weeks, possibly more, depending on the court. She stood on the boardwalk with the telegram and felt something she hadn't felt in 11 days, which was the specific loosening of something that has been held very tight for very long. She let it last exactly long enough to recognize it, and then she put the telegram in her coat and started planning what came next. Because a legal stay was not a resolution, and Crow was not a man who accepted interference with patients indefinitely. She was halfway back to the horse when she heard a rider coming down the main road from the north, moving at the kind of pace that isn't quite running, but is close to it. And she turned and saw Colton Voss on his gray horse, and they were both heading toward each other on the dusty main street of Prosper Creek at 8 in the morning. And she held up the telegram when he got close enough to see her arm raised. He reined in. She handed it up to him. He read it. He looked down at her from the saddle with an expression she couldn't entirely name relief. Yes, but also something intent, something that was already moving to the next problem before it had finished acknowledging the current one. Marsh filed this morning, he said. He was going to file at 9. It's just past 8. She looked up at him. Is it enough to stop the demand clause? A fraud challenge creates a mandatory stay in Texas civil court, he said. Yes, it stops the clock. He folded the telegram. Crow will know by this afternoon. She thought about what Crow would do when he knew. A man who built things as carefully and thoroughly as Silas Crow had built, this didn't simply accept a legal challenge and wait for the court to decide. He had resources, and he had patience, and he had people including, and this was the thought she'd been circling for 3 days without landing on it, directly including, possibly, someone on the inside of her own family. Colton, she said. He looked at her. What does Crow do when the legal move doesn't work? He was quiet for a moment. He applies pressure through whatever channel is still open to him. And if that channel is in my house, the gray horse shifted. Colton steadied it without looking away from her. His expression did something complex and settled. Then we need to close it before he uses it, he said. She had known that. She'd known it since the night she saw the telegram moved 2 inches to the right on her desk. But knowing it and saying it and doing what needed to be done about it were 3 separate things, and the third one was going to cost her something she hadn't figured out how to price yet. She looked at Colton. He looked back. The morning was coming fully up around them, the light going hard and gold, the way it did in Texas when the sun was serious about business. Down the street, the town was starting its day doors opening. Horses being let out, the ordinary sounds of ordinary life happening at a remove from where they were standing, as if they'd been placed slightly outside it. Come to the house, she said. There are things you need to know, and then we need to be ready, because by this afternoon we're going to find out what Crow does when he realizes he's running out of options. She put her foot in the stirrup and got up. They rode back toward the ranch in the gold morning, side by side, and behind them Prosper Creek went about its business, and the sky was clear and hard and very blue, and if you'd looked at the two of them at distance, you might have thought they looked like 2 people who had figured something out. What they'd figured out was a legal stay and a filing and a possible fraud claim, and that was not nothing. It was, in fact, considerably more than they'd had 2 weeks ago. But it was not finished, and they both knew it, and the knowing of it rode with them all the way back to the ranch, like a third presence between them, silent and patient, and waiting to see what came next. What came next arrived, faster than either of them had planned. It arrived in the shape of a conversation Vivienne was having at that exact moment at the kitchen table, the back door open, and her voice low and careful, and the particular quality of someone who is committed to a thing and is seeing it through regardless of the cost. Eliza heard it the moment she came through the front door. She stopped in the hallway. She stood completely still and listened to her sister's voice, carrying from the kitchen. And she understood within 4 sentences exactly what was happening, and exactly how much damage it would cause. And she felt the coal behind her sternum go from warm to something that burned clean and clear and without confusion. She had known. She had known, and she had hoped she was wrong. And she was not wrong. And now she had to decide what to do with being right in the next 30 seconds before the conversation in the kitchen concluded. She decided. She walked down the hall toward the kitchen with her boots on the floor, making no effort at quiet, and the voice stopped. And she pushed open the kitchen door, and Vivienne was standing at the table with a man she'd never seen before, not Crow. Not either of the two men from yesterday, but someone new, young, with a messenger bag that had papers visible at the top of it. The man looked at her. Vivienne looked at her. The papers in the bag were face up, and she could see the header on the top one from where she stood. It was a signed agreement. Her father's signature was at the bottom. She could see it from across the room. The silence in the kitchen was absolute. "Vivienne," Eliza said. Her voice came out very steady, which surprised even her. "What has Papa signed?" The young man with the messenger bag had the sense to look uncomfortable. He was maybe 22, hired help, the kind of person who delivers things for wages and doesn't ask what's in them, and he could out a short, ugly laugh. And he could read the room well enough to understand that he was standing in the middle of something that had been building long before he walked through the back door. Vivienne looked at Eliza with the expression she always reached for when she was cornered, not guilt, not apology, but a kind of preemptive dignity, the face of someone who has decided that what they did was necessary and has arranged their features to communicate that certainty before the argument starts. "Papa signed a consent agreement," Vivienne said, formalizing the arrangement with Crow. It needed to be done before the court filing complicated things. Before the court filing, Eliza stopped herself. She looked at the messenger. "Leave that here and go." He looked at Vivienne. Vivienne gave a small nod, and he set the bag on the table and went out the back door faster than he'd arrived. And then it was just the two of them, in the kitchen, with the bag on the table, between them and the morning light coming through the window at the angle that always made the kitchen feel warmer than it was. "Papa doesn't know about the fraud filing," Eliza said. "He doesn't know what Marsh filed this morning. Papa knows what the debt is. Papa knows what the options are. He doesn't know that one of the options changed this morning." She moved to the table. She reached into the bag and pulled out the papers and read the top page. It was a consent agreement, formal and complete, her father's signature at the bottom, in his particular cramped hand, the one he used for legal documents. He let out a short, ugly laugh, the one that looked different from his everyday writing, because he always tensed up when things were official. The date was yesterday. Crow's man must have come in the evening, when she was at the telegraph office, when the house was quiet and her father was alone with his fear. "When did he sign this?" she said. "Yesterday evening." "You arranged it." "I told Papa what his options were," Vivienne said. Her voice had the specific careful quality of someone who has rehearsed the honest version of a dishonest thing. "I told him that the legal challenge might not work in time, that Crow was going to move against the property if he didn't get an answer, and that the consent agreement was the only certain way to protect the ranch." "The certain way to protect the ranch," Eliza said slowly, "is to give Crow what he wanted from the beginning, which is me, as a legal transaction. It's a marriage, Eliza. It's not. Do not tell me what it is." She set the papers down. Her voice was still level, which she was finding harder to maintain by the sentence. "You went to Papa when he was alone and afraid, and you gave him the version of this situation that made the agreement look like the only door. And he signed it because he was scared, and you made sure the other options looked like they were closed." Vivienne said nothing. "Was Colton's telegram enough? Did you tell Crow that we had legal grounds being built?" A beat of silence. "I told him you were trying to find a way to challenge the documents. He needed to know the timeline was urgent." Eliza looked at her sister. The flower that was still faintly on Vivienne's dress from the bread she'd made yesterday, the bread that had been for their father, the small domestic gesture that had been real and genuine and had existed alongside everything else Vivienne had also been doing. That was the thing about her sister, that she had never been able to fully hold in her mind at once, that Vivienne was not entirely one thing, that the cruelty and the care existed in the same person, fed by the same complicated need, and the bread had been real, and the betrayal had been real, and they were both just Vivienne, being what she'd always been. "You've been talking to him this whole time," Eliza said. "Since the beginning." Vivienne's jaw tightened slightly. "I was protecting this family." "You were protecting your own idea of what this family should look like," Eliza said, "which is different. I'm going to find Colton. I'm going to fix this if it can be fixed. And when it's done, You and I are going to have a conversation about what comes next. Not now, when it's done. She picked up the papers, folded them, and put them in her coat pocket. Vivian's hand moved slightly, a small, instinctive gesture toward the papers, quickly stopped. Those belong to, she started. They'll be returned, Eliza said, when this is finished. She went out through the front door. Colton was at the fence, having dismounted, and he looked at her face when she came across the yard, and didn't ask a question, just waited. She handed him the papers. He read them. His face stayed still, but she'd been watching his face long enough now to see what stillness cost him. Dated yesterday, he said. Vivian arranged it. Papa signed when I wasn't here. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the consent agreement. This complicates the stay. I need you to tell me how much. He folded the papers and handed them back. The fraud filing creates a stay on the demand clause on the financial seizure provisions. But this, he paused, a consent agreement signed by the head of household formalizing a marriage arrangement is a civil matter, separate from the fraud challenge. Marsh's filing doesn't automatically nullify this. Crow could argue they're independent documents. Can he use this to override the stay? Not on the property seizure, no, but he can use it to begin marriage proceedings. And once those proceedings are formally initiated, the legal picture gets considerably more tangled. He looked at her. He could move as early as today, if he wants to push it. She absorbed this. The morning was fully up now. The sun passed the early angle and into the hard, clear light of midday approaching. Somewhere in the barn, Hector was doing the morning work, and the sounds of it came across the yard familiar. Steady, ongoing, like the ranch itself was indifferent to what was happening to its people. What do we need to stop him? She said. The consent agreement is only binding if it's the operative document, Colton said carefully. If we can demonstrate that the document it's based on, the original loan agreement, is itself fraudulent, we can argue the consent agreement is void because it was extracted under duress from a fraudulent premise. But that argument has to be made in court. It's not automatic. How long does that take? With Marsh pushing and with what we have? Days. Maybe a week. He looked at her. Crow's going to try to move faster than that. She looked at the fence, at the south pasture beyond it, where Duchess was moving. In the morning light, the wrapped leg still favoring but carrying her steadily. She thought about the 14 days that had become 11 that had become 5, and the legal stay that was supposed to buy time, but hadn't fully accounted for a signed consent agreement that Vivienne had maneuvered her father into signing. I need to talk to my father, she said. Yes, Colton said. And then I need to talk to Crow. He went still in a particular way. What do you mean? Talk to Crow? I mean, I need to be in a room with him, she said. I need to see what he does when he knows the legal challenge exists. And when he knows I have the consent agreement in my pocket, and when he has to talk to me directly instead of through documents and messengers. She looked at Colton. He's been operating around me. Through my father, through Vivian, through paperwork. I need to see who he is when he has to operate at me. Colton looked at her for a long moment. That's not without risk. Everything about this situation is not without risk. This at least puts me in the room. He nodded slowly. Not happily, but he nodded. Her father was in the study. He'd been there since she came back. She could tell the house had the quality of held breath that it got when Gerald Whitmore was in a room by himself dealing with something he didn't know how to face. She went in without knocking. He was at his desk, not working, just sitting with his hands flat on the surface, the way a man does when he needs to feel something solid. She put the consent agreement on the desk in front of him. He looked at it. Did you read it before you signed it? She said. Vivian read it to me. She sat down. Papa, listen to me carefully. This morning, Harlan Marsh, the lawyer in Fort Worth that Colton Voss has been working with, filed a formal fraud challenge against the original loan agreement, against Crow's loan. The fraud challenge creates a legal stay on the demand clause, which means Crow cannot trigger the seizure provisions while the case is under dispute. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Her father was looking at her with the expression of a man who is processing information faster than he wants to. When did this happen this morning? Before 8 o'clock. She paused. Before Vivienne sent her messenger with this document to be returned to Crow. Closed his eyes, just briefly, opened them. She told me the legal challenge wasn't going to work in time, he said. She told you that last night, when she didn't know what Marsh had filed. Or when she did know and chose not to tell you. She watched her father absorb this. I don't know which one it was. I've stopped being sure about what Vivian knows when she tells me she doesn't know it. He was quiet. The clock on the study wall ticked. Outside the window, a bird landed on the fence rail and left. "Can the consent agreement be undone?" he said. "If you want to rescind it, you have the right to do that before proceedings are formally initiated." Marsh would have to argue it was signed under fraudulent duress, which he can do. But Crow is going to move quickly once he has this document in hand, and if he initiates proceedings before we can get to a judge. She stopped. "I need you to write a rescission. Today. Now. Colton can take it to Marsh." Her father looked at the consent agreement. He looked at it for a long time. She waited because the situation required waiting and because she had enough respect for the difficulty of what she was asking to give him the space to get there without being pushed. "I made decisions I shouldn't have made alone," he said. He'd said something close to this before, but this time it sat differently in his voice, less like an approaching apology and more like a man understanding the full meaning of something he'd said previously without meaning. "I know. I made them because I was afraid, and because stopped. Because Vivian made the afraid seem reasonable," she said, not unkindly. "She's my daughter. So am I. Just that. Not with weight, not with accusation. Just the plain fact of it." He looked at her. Something in his face did something she hadn't seen it do in a long time, something that had to do with seeing her. Actually seeing her, not the useful person who ran his ranch, not the capable one who handled the things he didn't want to handle, but her. He reached for a pen. Colton was back on his horse and heading toward the telegraph office with the rescission document inside 20 minutes of her father signing it. She watched him go from the front porch and then went back inside to do the things she'd been putting off for the last hour. She went to find Vivienne. Her sister was in her room. She was sitting at her vanity, not doing anything to her hair or her face, just sitting in front of the mirror looking at herself. She heard Eliza come in and didn't turn around. "Papa wrote a rescission," Eliza said. Vivienne watched her in the mirror. "I know you'd convince him." He convinced himself. "I gave him accurate information, and he made a decision." She stood in the doorway. "What were you trying to do, Vivienne?" "Not the version you tell yourself." For a moment she thought Vivienne wasn't going to answer. Her sister had a talent for strategic silence that she'd deployed all their lives. But something in the question, or maybe in the way it was asked, without anger, without the sharpness their conversations usually carried, seemed to reach something different. "I was afraid," Vivienne said. Her voice was quiet and didn't have the composed quality she usually maintained. "I was afraid we were going to lose everything, and there wasn't going to be anything left, and someone had to do something that actually worked. And you decided that the thing that would work was me. I decided that you were the one Crow wanted, and that wanting was something we could use." She looked at Eliza's reflection. "You're always the practical one. I thought you'd see it was practical." "It was practical," Eliza said, "like selling off a piece of equipment. Very practical." Vivienne looked away from the mirror. "That's not what I meant. I think it is what you meant. I think you've been meaning it for a long time without putting it in those words." Eliza was quiet for a moment. "I don't think you're a bad person. I think you've spent your whole life in a place where what you look like matters more than what you do, and you built a set of skills for surviving that place, and those skills have made you into someone who can do something like this and call it family loyalty." She paused. "That's not an excuse. I'm telling you what I see because I think you should hear it from someone who isn't going to deliver it as a verdict." Vivienne was very still. "When this is resolved," Eliza said, "you and I need to figure out how to live in the same house differently than we have been. I don't know yet if that's possible, but I'm willing to try if you are." She didn't wait for an answer. She went downstairs. Silas Crow received the rescission document at 2 in the afternoon. He received it alongside notification from the county clerk's office of the dispute flag on the Henderson parcel claim. He received both within 30 minutes of each other, which she imagined had a particular effect on a man who liked to control timing. He arrived at Whitmore's crossing at 4. Eliza had been expecting this. She was on the front porch when he rode in. Just her, she'd asked Colton to stay back, inside the house within earshot but not in the yard. This was the conversation she'd told him she needed to have, and she needed to have it without Crow being able to direct it toward another man in the room. He dismounted without hurrying and came to the base of the porch steps and looked up at her. His face had changed since the parlor. The pleasantness was still there, but it was thinner, covering something that had less patience in it. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Crow, your father seems to have changed his mind." My father made an informed decision, she said. He wasn't informed when he signed your document. He is now. Crow put one foot on the bottom step. He didn't come up, just rested his weight there. I'd like to speak to Gerald. Gerald isn't available. You can speak to me. He looked at her for a moment. Then he smiled the particular smile of a man who has decided that directness might be more efficient than his usual method. The fraud challenge isn't going to hold up, Miss Whitmore. My lawyers are already preparing a response that will demonstrate the documentation is entirely in order. I've done this before. I know you have, she said. That's actually the problem. You've done it to 6 other ranches. We have affidavits from 3 of the affected families and documentation from all 6 properties showing the same structural pattern in the loan terms. That's not a challenge to one document. That's a pattern of practice. The smile went away. Not dramatically, it just stopped being there. The way a lamp stops when you cut the wick. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, which was the absence of performance. Just him assessing the actual situation. What do you want? He said. I want the original loan retired, she said, full stop. Not renegotiated, converted to another arrangement. Retired, with a signed release of all claims on the property and the water rights and the Henderson parcel. He was very still. That's a significant amount of money to walk away from. It's a fraudulent debt that's going to be ruled unenforceable in court, she said. You can walk away from it now, or you can walk away from it in 6 months after a judge has examined the altered dates and the traced signature and the testimony of the 6 other families, and after your name has been the subject of public court proceedings in 3 counties. She held his gaze. I know which one I'd choose. The yard was very quiet. From inside the house she could hear nothing, which meant Colton was listening as carefully as the house would allow and being exactly as silent as she'd asked. Crow looked at her for a long time. She had the feeling of being weighed not the proprietary weight of his earlier assessment, but something more genuine, more like actual evaluation, recognizing that what he was looking at was not what he'd planned for. You've been talking to Voss, he said. I've been talking to a lawyer in Fort Worth and a county clerk and my father, she said. Colton Voss helped. But this is my property and my family and my problem to solve. Voss has been building a case against me for 8 months, Crow said. It wasn't an accusation. It was just him laying it out, establishing what he knew. He came to Prosper Creek specifically because of your family. He came because of what you did to other families, she said. Mine was the most recent. He looked away from her for a moment at the yard, at the barn, at the pasture beyond the fence. She had the sense of a man recalculating, running numbers in his head that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with risk. The fraud challenge will take time, he said, even if Marsh is as good as Voss says he is. During that time, there's considerable inconvenience for your family. There's been considerable inconvenience for my family for 3 years, she said. We're accustomed to it. He looked back at her. Something in his expression shifted toward something she hadn't seen there yet, which was a kind of professional respect, not warm, not personal, but the respect of an adversary who has been outworked. If I walk away from the debt, he said slowly, Voss doesn't pursue the case against me. That's not something I can promise, she said. Colton Voss makes his own decisions. But the 3 families who gave affidavits made them in the context of this investigation. And if the investigation's primary subject resolves quietly, that context changes. She paused. I'm not offering you safety, Mr. Crow. I'm offering you a choice between a bad outcome and a worse one. He was quiet for what felt like a long time, but was probably 30 seconds. I'll need my lawyers to draft the release documents, he said finally. Your lawyers can draft them, she said. Harlan Marsh will review them before anyone signs anything. He looked at her one more time. She looked back. Neither of them said anything, and in the silence was the clear, mutual understanding of 2 people who see each other accurately without the convenience of underestimation to soften it. He put his foot off the step. He went to his horse. He mounted without looking back and rode out of the yard at the same unhurried pace at which he'd arrived, and she watched him go until he was off the property. And then she let out a breath she'd been holding since he dismounted. Her hands were shaking slightly. She noticed this and found it interesting she'd felt nothing during the conversation. But her hands had apparently been scared the whole time without consulting her. The front door opened behind her. Colton came out and stood beside her on the porch, looking at the empty road. He's going to do it, he said. It wasn't a question. I think so. His lawyers will stall and revise, but yes. She looked at her hands and curled them into loose fists until the trembling stopped. He's a practical man. It's what Vivian said about me, actually. That crow wanted me because I was practical. She paused. Practical people understand when the math has changed. Colton was quiet for a moment. You were impressive. I was terrified. I know, he said. That's what makes it impressive. She looked at him sideways. He was watching the road still, and his profile in the afternoon light was the profile of a man who had spent a lot of years thinking about difficult things and had not been made easy by the thinking, just more capable. The documents aren't signed yet, she said. No, we have more work. Marsh needs to review whatever Crow's lawyers produce. And the Henderson parcel dispute, Marsh can file the permanent challenge once the loan release is signed. Without the loan leverage, Crow's claim on the parcel is significantly weakened. It'll still go to court, but the outcome is considerably more favorable. She nodded. There was always more. In her experience, when you thought you'd reached the edge of a problem and found it had a further edge behind it. But standing on the porch in the late afternoon, with the shaking in her hands subsiding, and the empty road in front of her, and Colton Voss standing beside her with his hat in his hands, she let herself acknowledge that they were closer to the other side of this than they'd been that morning. It wasn't finished, but it wasn't impossible anymore either. 3 days later, Crow's lawyers sent the first draft of the release document to Marsh. It was full of language designed to preserve options that the release was supposed to close, which was what she'd expected, and Marsh sent back a revised version with the problematic clauses removed and 2 new conditions added. This went back and forth over the course of 4 days, which was 4 days of Eliza waking up and checking for telegrams and going to bed, having read the latest revision and thought about it until she was too tired to think anymore. On the 5th day, Marsh sent a final version. On the 6th day, Crow's lawyer sent a signed copy. She was at the kitchen table when the telegram confirming the signing came through, delivered by young Perkins, who'd started holding hertograms apart from the others when she came in, which she stopped finding surprising. She read it twice. She put it down on the table. Her father was across from her with his coffee. He read her face before she said anything, and something in him, some long-held tension she'd been watching in his posture for months. Maybe years went out of him, the way a fire goes out. Not dramatically, just gradually absent. It's done, he said. The release is signed. Marsh will file the permanent challenge on the Henderson parcel this afternoon. She folded the telegram. We still have the debt we owed before Crow manipulated the interest. The original principle. That's real, and we'll have to address it. But it's manageable. It's a real number. Her father looked at his hands. He looked old and tired and something else, something that might have been the beginning of a man coming back to himself after a long time of being less than himself. I'm sorry, he said. She looked at him. He was looking at his hands, not at her, which meant he was being sincere rather than performing sincerity. Gerald Whitmore performing an apology looked at your face. Gerald Whitmore actually making one looked at the floor. I know, she said. That's not enough. No, she said. It's not, but it's something to start with. She got up and poured herself coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the ranch, the barn, the pasture, the fence line where she'd met Colton Voss on the first morning, the south field where Duchess was moving free and easy now, the wrapped leg fully healed and carrying her with the simple, uncomplicated confidence of a horse who has recovered and doesn't spend time thinking about what hurt. Vivienne came in from the hallway and stopped when she saw Eliza's face. She read it correctly. It's finished, she said. The release is signed. Vivienne stood in the doorway. She looked at the table, at their father, at Eliza. Her face was doing something complicated that she wasn't covering with the usual performance. She looked, for a moment, like the girl she'd been before, whatever had made her into what she'd become, not young. Exactly, but unguarded. Caught in something genuine. I'm glad, she said. And it was true. Eliza could hear it. She didn't say anything back. She turned to the window again and drank her coffee and let the morning be what it was, imperfect, ongoing, full of things that weren't resolved and things that were, and the complicated truth of a family that had damaged itself and was going to have to figure out slowly and without any guarantee of success whether it was capable of being something better. Colton came to the house that afternoon. She'd been expecting him. He'd been in town when the telegram came through, handling the final coordination with the county clerk. He came through the yard with his hat off, and his horse tied at the fence, and she met him on the porch because she'd found that the porch was where the clearest conversations happened. He had a copy of the signed release in his hand. He gave it to her. She looked at it at Crow's signature and Marsh's notation, and the date and the formal language that meant the debt was gone. And claims were released, and the thing that had been hanging over the ranch for 3 years was no longer legally operative. She held it for a moment, just held it. Henderson parcel challenge is filed, Colton said. Marsh thinks it resolves in our favor within 60 days, given Crow's weakened position. Our favor, she said. He looked at her. A small correction. Your favor. She nodded. She looked at the document, and then she put it carefully inside her coat, against her chest, where it stayed warm from her body heat, and felt solid and real and very much like the thing it was, which was proof that a thing she had fought for had been won. What now, she said, for you? He was quiet for a moment. The afternoon was cooling, the way Texas afternoons do when they've made their point about the heat and are moving on. I have ranches to manage. Marsh has other cases in the region. The work isn't finished. I know, she said. I meant what now? Tonight. Tomorrow. He looked at her. She held his gaze and didn't look away, because she'd spent 31 years looking away from things she wanted, and she was finding it a habit she was less interested in maintaining. Tonight, he said, I thought I might stay for supper. The offer was there. It's there, she said. And tomorrow, he said, I thought I might look at that north fence line you mentioned. The one that needs work. She looked at him. That's at least 3 days of work. I know, he said. She looked at the yard, at the barn. Pasture and the fence line in the south field, where Duchess was still moving in the late afternoon light, easy and steady and completely herself. I'll get Hector to show you the worst section in the morning, she said. He put his hat back on. She went inside to start supper, and the ranch went about its evening business around her, the horses settling, the light going gold and long across the grass, Hector's voice, somewhere across the yard, saying something to one of the hands, her father's footsteps in the hall, ordinary sounds of an ordinary evening on a property that was still, against considerable odds, theirs. The release document was in her coat. The debt was gone. The work was still everywhere, because the work was always everywhere. But for the first time, in longer than she could accurately remember, the work was just work. That was enough. That was in fact more than enough. It wasn't the end. Vivienne was still Vivienne, and her father was still her father, and the ranch still had a real debt and a real set of problems that required real solutions, and none of them were going to be easy or simple or arrived at without argument and difficulty and the occasional sleepless 3 a.m. when things looked worse than they probably were. But Eliza Whitmore had always been a person who lived in the real version of things rather than the comfortable version. And the real version of this evening was that she was setting the table in her own kitchen, in her own house, on land that belonged to her family, and nobody was going to take it. Outside, Colton's gray horse was at the fence, and Colton was talking to Hector about the north fence line, and Hector was nodding in the way. He nodded when he respected what he was hearing, and the sky was going to all the colors it went to, when it was finishing the day properly. Eliza put another plate on the table and went to the window and looked out at all of it, and let herself feel, just for that moment, the full weight of what hadn't been lost. Supper that evening was not a comfortable meal, but it was an honest one, which Eliza had come to believe was worth more. Her father sat at the head of the table, where he'd always sat, but something in the way he occupied the chair was different, less performance of the head of household, more just a man at a table. Colton sat across from Eliza, which put him beside Hector, who had been invited in the offhand way. Eliza invited Hector to things, which was by setting a plate at his usual spot without asking whether he was coming. Vivienne sat at the far end and was quiet in a way that wasn't sulking so much as processing, which Eliza judged to be genuine and left alone. The food was simple. Eliza had made what she knew how to make well, rather than attempting anything that required concentration she didn't currently have. So there was roasted chicken and potatoes, and bread from the loaf Vivienne had made the day before, and nobody commented on any of it except Colton, who said the bread was good, and Vivienne, who said thank you with the careful naturalness of someone practicing a response they weren't entirely comfortable with yet. Her father asked Colton about Montana, not about business, about what it was like there, the land, the winters. Colton answered without embellishment, the way he talked about everything. And Gerald Whitmore listened, with the particular attention of a man who is making himself present in a conversation, because he knows he has been absent from too many. It was imperfect. It was awkward in places. But it was happening. And Eliza ate her supper and let it happen around her, without managing it, which was something she had to consciously choose. After supper, Hector went back to his quarters, and her father went to the study not for the whiskey, she noted, but for the ranch accounts, which he'd started reviewing in the evenings, with a consistency she was still getting used to. It was as if the signing of the release had returned something to him, or maybe more accurately returned him to something he'd been before the debt made him smaller. Vivienne cleared the table. Colton helped, which seemed to surprise Vivienne slightly, the slight recalibration of her expression when he picked up his own plate without being asked. Eliza noticed Vivienne watching him for a moment, with an expression she couldn't quite read, something between assessment and something more uncomfortable, which was the specific look a person gets when they're revising an idea about someone and finding the revision unflattering to themselves. When the table was clear, Vivienne said goodnight and went upstairs. Eliza and Colton sat on the porch in the cooling air with the last of the day's light going out over the pasture, and they were quiet for a while, in the way of people who have been through something together and don't need to fill the aftermath with words. "She's going to be all right," Colton said eventually. He wasn't talking about Vivienne. Eliza looked at him. "I know, I meant the horse, Duchess," she almost laughed. Came out as something shorter, a sound she didn't make often. "I know what you meant." He looked at the pasture. "I meant all of it, actually." She looked at the pasture, too. The dark shapes of the horses in the field, the fence line running its length in the fading light. The ranch she'd been running for 15 years, with her hands in her back and her particular stubborn refusal to let things go to ruin, even when they wanted to. It was still here. She was still here. "It's going to take time," she said. "The actual debt that remains, the original principal. We'll need to renegotiate with the bank. Fletcher at the bank isn't going to be enthusiastic. Fletcher at the bank is going to be considerably more accommodating, now that Crow's claim is released," Colton said. "Marsh can document the circumstances that led to the debt's current state. That gives you standing to ask for terms that reflect the actual situation rather than the manipulated one." "Thought about this. I've been thinking about it for a while." She looked at him. He was looking at the pasture still, his profile in the last light. She had been looking at his profile for 3 weeks now, long enough that she'd noticed its specific qualities without deciding what to do with that noticing. "How long are you staying?" she asked. He turned to look at her then. "As long as there's work to do," he said, "and there's a lot of work to do." She held his gaze for a moment. "That's not an answer." "The honest version of an answer," he said. "I'm not a man who's good at the other kind." She looked back at the pasture. She thought about that. She thought about what it meant to let someone into the work, into the actual daily difficult labor of a thing that mattered, which was different from letting them into your company over supper. She had been alone in the work for so long that the aloneness had started to feel like a feature rather than a condition. "The north fence needs 3 days," she said, "minimum." "I know," he said. "I looked at it with Hector this afternoon. After that, the east pasture drainage has been wrong since the spring rains. That's a week, maybe more. I've done drainage work before." "I imagine you have." She paused. "The point I'm making is that there's enough work here to keep someone for a considerable time if they were inclined to stay for it." He was quiet for a moment. "Then I'm inclined." She nodded once. The air had gone fully cool now, and the pasture was dark, and the first stars were showing above the far tree line, and the ranch made its night sounds around them. The horse settling, the wind through the grass, the distant creak of the barn. Familiar sounds. Her sounds. She went inside first because the morning came early and she didn't make habits of ignoring that. She said good night in the plain way, and he said good night back, and that was sufficient, and she went to bed and slept better than she had in 3 weeks, which wasn't perfect, but was real. 50 days that Harlan Marsh had predicted for the Henderson parcel challenge turned into 53. Crow's lawyers filed 2 objections, both of which Marsh addressed efficiently and without drama. And on the 53rd day, the county court ruled in favor of the Whitmore challenge on the grounds that Crow's original purchase filing had been submitted before the Henderson estate was legally cleared for sale, which made the filing procedurally invalid. The Henderson sold reverted to open sale status, which meant anyone could now file a legitimate purchase claim. Eliza filed one the same afternoon. She'd been holding the paperwork ready for 2 weeks. She didn't tell anyone she was doing it until it was done. She told her father that evening over supper just that she'd filed, and what the parcel meant for the ranch's market access, and what they could do with the water rights if they managed the southeast corner well. Her father listened and nodded, and asked 2 practical questions, and didn't once say anything about whether she should have consulted him first, which was a change she was still adjusting to. The bank negotiation was harder. Fletcher was not a bad man, but he was a cautious one, and cautious men at banks have a way of dressing their caution in the language of concern while actually just protecting themselves. Eliza went to 3 meetings with Marsh's documentation and her own account records, and on the 3rd meeting brought Colton, not to speak for her, but because his name and his known operation had a weight in financial conversations that she was practical enough to use. Fletcher gave them terms she could work with. Not generous terms, there was nothing generous about a bank in Eliza's experience, but workable ones, with a repayment structure that matched the ranch's actual production capacity and an interest rate that was, for once, a real number and not a mechanism. She shook Fletcher's hand and walked out of the bank into the afternoon and stood on the boardwalk for a moment, just standing there with the paperwork in her hand and the town going past and not saying anything. "Sisi, that's the last of it," she said. "The last of the formal part," he said. She looked at the paperwork. "The rest is just work." "The rest is just work," he agreed. She folded the papers into her coat, thought about Margaret Pruitt, who had told her, in that pleasant, devastating way, that Crow was practical and had chosen the capable sister. She thought about the parlor and her father's chair and the look on his face when she'd told him what Vivienne had arranged. She thought about the consent agreement and the rescission and the kitchen table and the long sequence of ordinary days it had taken to get from one to the other. She was not a woman who believed that things worked out because they were supposed to. She was a woman who believed that things worked out because someone did the work and she had done the work and it had worked out. And those were related facts, but not in the way that made the outcome feel inevitable. It had been close. It had been, on several mornings, a thing she could not see the other side of. That was the part she wanted to hold on to not the resolution, which was always cleaner in retrospect than it had been in the living, but the fact that she'd kept going through, the part she couldn't see through. That felt like the true thing. In the weeks that followed, Prosper Creek managed the information about the Whitmore situation in the way small towns manage information about their own slowly, incompletely, with a great deal of revision as more facts became available. Margaret Pruitt said 3 different things on 3 different occasions, and by the time the 3rd version was circulating, it bore only a passing resemblance to the first. The general understanding that settled was that Silas Crow had been involved in some sort of legal dispute with the Whitmores and had come off the worse for it, and that the woman who ran the Whitmore Ranch had been the one responsible for the outcome. Eliza found this version acceptable because it was accurate in the parts that mattered. What she didn't expect was Clara Whitfield coming to the ranch one Tuesday morning to ask, directly and with admirable bluntness, whether Eliza would be willing to look at loan documents her family was in the process of signing with a lender whose terms she'd found difficult to follow. Clara's family ran a small spread 8 miles south and had been struggling quietly for 2 years, and she'd heard that Eliza had learned something about reading loan documents and wasn't afraid of what she found. Eliza looked at Clara Whitfield's loan documents. She spent 2 evenings on them. She found 3 clauses she didn't like and wrote up a plain language explanation of what they meant and what to ask the lender to change. Clara took the explanation to the lender. The lender revised 2 of the 3 clauses. It was not a dramatic event. It was just a Tuesday. But then Tom Aldrin, yes, that Tom Aldrin, whose wildflowers she'd kept in a tin can, until they turned to dust, came by the following week to ask us the same thing. For a different reason, and then a widow named Sadie Holt sent a note asking if Eliza would look at a contract she'd been offered for grazing rights on her east pasture. And somewhere in the middle of these requests, Eliza sat at her kitchen table one evening and realized that she had spent 31 years being useful in ways nobody acknowledged. And apparently the universe had decided that some of that usefulness was going to start being acknowledged now. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. She sat with it for a few evenings before she decided she felt cautiously like it was a thing worth continuing. Colton stayed, not in the way of someone who has no other place to be, but in the way of someone who has made a decision and is living it out in daily practical increments. He wrote to his Montana operation regularly and received reports back and made decisions about the double V from the kitchen table of Whitmore's Crossing with the same focused attention he brought to everything. And the men who ran his Montana spread apparently were capable enough to manage without him present, which spoke well of both them and him. He and Eliza worked alongside each other in the particular way of two people who have agreed on something without fully articulating what the agreement is. They fixed the north fence. They addressed the east pasture drainage, which did take more than a week. They rebuilt the secondary water channel from the southeast corner, which became possible once the Henderson parcel purchase was confirmed, and the new access to the water source changed the ranching calculus for the summer in ways that made the numbers in Eliza's evening accounting sit differently. They argued about the channel approach twice. Both times the argument was real, not performed disagreement, but actual difference of opinion about the right method, the kind of argument that requires both people to know what they're talking about and be willing to say so. The first argument, Colton's approach was better, and Eliza said so when she'd had time to look at what he was proposing. The second argument, she was right, and he worked it out himself after a day and came back and said so. Neither of these moments was particularly graceful, but they were functional, and function had always been what she trusted. She trusted him in the way she'd trusted very few people carefully, incrementally, based on what he actually did rather than what he said. It was not a fast process. He seemed to understand that without her having to explain it, which was something she found she valued more than she'd expected. One evening in early November, about 2 months after the release was signed, they were sitting on the porch after supper. This had become a habit that neither of them had named, and Colton said, "I wrote to my lawyer about the Montana properties this week." She looked at him. "All right, I've been thinking about whether the operation makes sense the way it's currently structured." He had his hat in his hands, turning it slowly. "It's a lot of land to manage from a distance. You've been managing it from here for 2 months." "I have." He looked at her. "What I'm saying is that I've been considering a different arrangement, one that would make it less separate, less like two things and more like one thing." She held his gaze. She understood what he was working toward. She had understood it for a while, if she was being honest, which she made a practice of being. "You're not a man who talks around things," she said. "So don't." He was quiet for a moment. The hat turned once more in his hands. "Eliza, what we've been building here, I'm not talking about the fence and the drainage channel. I'm talking about what we've been building here." He paused. "I'd like to keep building it, if that's something you want." She looked at the pasture, at the dark familiar shapes of the horses and the fence line and the south field she'd walked 10,000 times. She thought about 31 years of mornings, alone with the work, of carrying things by herself, not because she preferred it, but because there'd been no one she trusted to carry them alongside her. She thought about what it had felt like that first morning at the fence, to be seen doing something and have it called what it was. "I'm not easy to live alongside," she said. "I know that. I have opinions about how things are done. I've noticed. I'm not going to defer on decisions that affect this property." "I would find it alarming if you did," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at her with the direct steadiness she'd gotten used to, the look that didn't require her to be less than she was or perform being more than she was. Just the actual look of a person seeing another person. "All right," she said. He looked at her. "All right, don't make it a ceremony," she said. "We have work in the morning." He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it. "I know," he said. 7 o'clock? 6:30, she said. "The east field drainage needs another check before the winter freeze sets in." He put his hat on. She went inside. She stood in the kitchen for a moment in the dark and let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened, which was quiet and unremarkable from the outside and considerable from the inside. And then she went to bed and slept. She told her father the next morning over coffee, just directly, the same way she did everything that she and Colton had agreed to build something together. He let out a short, ugly laugh, and that it would involve changes to how the ranch operated and how the properties related to each other, and she wanted him to hear it from her. Her father put down his cup. He looked at her for a moment, with an expression she recognized now, the genuine one, the one he'd been using more frequently since the release was signed. The face of a man trying to see things accurately rather than conveniently. "Is this what you want?" he said. She looked at him. Question surprised her not because it was wrong, but because he had not, historically, been a man who asked what she wanted. He'd assumed her wants aligned with necessity, which was convenient and mostly accurate, but was not the same thing as asking. He nodded. He picked up his coffee. "Then I'm glad." He paused. "He's a good man. He's a practical man," she said. "I'll figure out the rest." Her father looked at her and did something unexpected, which was to laugh, a small, short sound, genuine in a way she hadn't heard from him in years. "You sound like your mother," he said. She didn't know what to do with that. She drank her coffee with that, so she transmittent, which was sometimes the right response to the things that mattered. Vivienne left in January. Not in anger, not in crisis in the considered way of someone who has looked at the version of their life in one place and decided that another version elsewhere might fit them better. She'd been corresponding with a cousin in Austin for months, a fact Eliza learned only when Vivienne told her, and the correspondence had evolved into an invitation to come and help run a dressmaking business the cousin was establishing. She told Eliza on a Sunday afternoon. She had the particular composure of someone who has made a decision they're uncertain about and is holding the uncertainty very still. "Austin," Eliza said. "Alice needs someone who can manage the client side of things. The business end." Vivienne looked at her hands. I'm better at that than I've been at this." Eliza looked at her sister. She thought about everything she could say, the things that were true and complicated and unresolved, and probably always would be somewhat unresolved, because that was the nature of people who had hurt each other in ways that mattered. "When do you leave?" she asked. "End of the month. Then you have 3 weeks. You should spend them however you need to." Vivienne looked up. She'd been expecting something else. Eliza could see it. The bracing for the harder conversation. When it didn't come, something in her sister's face shifted. "I know what I did," Vivienne said quietly. "I know the whole of it. Don't expect you to. I'm not asking for anything." "I know you're not," Eliza said. "Vivienne." She waited until her sister looked at her directly. "I don't know what we are to each other now. I don't think either of us knows yet. But you're my sister and you're not a bad person? You're a complicated person who made bad choices when you were afraid, which is something I understand better than I'd like to." Vivienne said nothing. Her eyes were bright in a way that she was visibly working to manage. "Write to me," Eliza said. "When you're settled. Let me know how it goes." "I will," Vivienne said. Her voice was not quite steady. "And Vivienne," she paused, "be useful there. Not just charming. Useful. You're better at the useful than you've let yourself be." Her sister looked at her for a moment that held a great deal in it. Then she nodded once and went upstairs. Eliza sat in the parlor for a while afterward and thought about the two of them, the decades of friction, and the bread that had been real, and the blue dress, and the tin can of wildflowers, and the night on the porch, and the letter that had been sent, and the rescission that had followed. She thought about the strange, compressed truth of sisters, that you can be the person who knows someone most accurately and love them least comfortably, and those two things can live in the same house for a lifetime, without resolving into anything simpler. She didn't know if they'd find their way to something easier. She thought it was possible. That was the most honest thing she could say about it. January brought cold that was serious about its intentions, and Eliza and Colton spent the first 2 weeks of it winterizing the barn and checking the herd and doing the particular grinding work of a ranch, preparing for the hard months. It was not romantic work. It was cold and dirty and physically demanding, and by the end of most days, she was tired in her hands and her back and her hips, and Colton was not visibly much better. And they ate supper and did the books and went to bed and got up and did it again. This was what she'd wanted to make sure he understood before anything was settled between them, not the idea of the ranch, but the ranch. The daily reality of it, which was not a story about land and cattle and sunsets, but a long, ongoing, unglamorous commitment to keeping something alive through all the seasons, including the ones that wanted to kill it. He understood it. She could see that in the way he worked, in the way he didn't need to be directed or managed, in the way he knew when to ask and when to act, and when to just stand alongside without doing anything except being present. She was not sure yet what to make of being loved by someone who understood the work. It was unfamiliar territory. She approached it the way she approached everything unfamiliar, which was carefully, with attention, without pretending it was simpler than it was. One morning in late January, she came into the kitchen before dawn and found Colton already at the table with the accounts spread in front of him and a cup of coffee that had been there long enough to be almost cold. He let out a short, ugly laugh. He'd found something in the numbers she could tell by the way he was sitting, the forward angle of his attention. "What?" she said. "The breeding line on the quarter horses," he said. "If we cross the mare you've been developing with the double V stud I brought down from Montana, the line we'd get is significant. I've been looking at the market values." She poured her coffee and came to the table and looked at what he'd been calculating. He moved over to give her room, and she sat down and looked at the numbers, and they were good, genuinely good. The kind of numbers that could change the financial shape of the next 3 years. "This would take 2 seasons to develop," she said. "I know, and the stud fee. It's a different arrangement when you're talking about combining operations rather than hiring out." He looked at her. "That's the part I've been working through." She looked at the numbers. She thought about 2 seasons of careful breeding work and what it would produce and what it would do to the account books and what it would require from both of them in terms of sustained commitment to a plan that wouldn't pay off immediately. "All right," she said. "You don't want to think about it?" I've been looking at this breeding line for 2 years, she said. "I've thought about it." He nodded. She drank her coffee, and he picked up his pen, and they sat at the kitchen table in the early dark and planned the next 2 seasons of Whitmore's Crossing. And it was quiet and practical, and full of specific real numbers, and it was one of the better mornings she'd had in memory. There is a thing that happens to people who spend years being invisible. They start to believe the invisibility is a quality of themselves, rather than a quality of how they're being seen. They start to explain away the wanting to be known, to be chosen, to be fought for, because wanting what you've never had begins to feel like a failure of realism rather than a reasonable human need. Eliza Whitmore had done this for a long time. She was practical, so she'd dressed the doing of it in practical language. She'd told herself she didn't need much, when what she meant was she'd stopped expecting much. She'd told herself she preferred to be alone in the work, when what she meant was she'd stopped trusting company in it. She understood now, in the clear light of what this year had been, that those were not the same things. There was a difference between choosing your own company and having no other option. That she had spent years in the second situation, while telling herself it was the first. The thing about being seen, actually seen, the way Colton had seen her that first morning with the horse, the way he'd said she's good at it in front of her father like it was a plain and obvious fact, is that it doesn't fix everything. It doesn't undo the years of being the other kind of woman in a town that had a clear preference for a different kind. It doesn't resolve the complicated mess of a family that damaged itself and is now in the process of doing something different, which is harder and slower than the damage was. What it does is make the present feel inhabitable in a different way. Like the air has changed composition slightly. Like you can take a fuller breath than you could before and not entirely be sure why. She didn't talk about this with anyone. It wasn't the kind of thing she talked about, but she thought about it on the mornings she was out, early and the light was coming across the pasture, and Duchess was moving in the field with her easy-heeled gait, and the ranch was making its sounds around her, and she thought that the woman who had spent 31 years invisible, had not become visible because someone rescued her. She had become visible because she refused to disappear, and she kept working, and eventually the world had no choice but to look at what she'd been doing all along. That felt true. That felt like the thing worth holding. The frontier doesn't give things. It yields things sometimes to people who have worked for them long enough and smart enough, and with enough stubborn refusal to accept the first bad answer. She had worked for 31 years on this land. She had not given up the work when it was ugly, or when it was lonely, or when the numbers were bad, or when the people who were supposed to fight for her didn't. She had kept going because it was hers, and she knew what it was worth, even when nobody else did. That, in the end, was what she was proudest of. Not the legal filing, or the confrontation with Crow, or the account books that were finally telling a story she could live with. Those were results. What she was proudest of was what had produced them the daily, unremarked, unwitnessed decision to show up and do the work, and not become less than herself, because less would have been more comfortable. She was not perfect. She was still short on patience when things didn't move the way she thought they should. She was still too quick to take problems onto herself rather than asking for help. And she knew it, and she was working on it in the slow, imperfect way of someone who has ingrained a habit for good reasons, and now has to find the good reasons for a different habit. She and Colton still argued when they disagreed, and she was still more comfortable in silence than in conversation. And there were mornings she woke up tired in a bone-deep way that one night's sleeps never addressed. But the ranch was hers. The work was hers. The future being built on the east pasture, and the quarter-horse breeding line and the slowly recovering account books that was hers. And she had made it, and nobody had given it to her. Colton Voss had helped. She would say that plainly and without qualification, because she wasn't a person who diminished what was real in order to make her own story cleaner. He had helped, and the help had mattered, and the help had been offered without any expectation of gratitude or ownership, which was rarer than it should be. And one evening in February, with the cold finally starting to loosen its grip on the ground, and the first tentative signs of the year turning visible in the pasture grass, Colton said, "I'd like to ask you properly, if you're willing." She looked at him across the kitchen table. The accounts were between them, which she found fitting. "Ask," she said. "Eliza Whitmore," he said. He wasn't performing the asking, he was just doing it, the plain way he did everything. "I'm asking whether you'll build this with me, not as mine, not as a transaction, as your own person who has decided this is what you want." He paused. "Because I want to know that it's what you want." She looked at him. The specific face of this man who had arrived at her fence with careful questions and had stayed for the difficult work, and had never once tried to manage her into being easier than she was. "It's what I want," she said. He nodded. "All right." "That's it," she said. "That's it," he said. "Unless you want a ceremony." "I don't want a ceremony," she said. "I want the east fence checked in the morning." 6:30, he said. 6, she said. He looked at her. She looked back. Something passed between them that didn't have a name and didn't need one, and she went back to the accounts, and he went back to his coffee, and outside the February wind moved across the pasture of Whitmore's, crossing. Her land, her life, and the horses stood in the field in the cold, and the stars were out, and the work went on. It was not a perfect life. She had never wanted a perfect life. She had wanted a real one, with the full weight of real things in it, real work, real difficulty, real people who showed up, even when the showing up was hard. She had that now. She had earned it. And she was not done yet, not even close, which was exactly the way she wanted it.